All right, so this is Ixl C8, which are proofs. Now you got to think of proofs as kind of like a puzzle. You have to make sure that the reasons that you give for each line of the statement kind of matches and goes through some kind of logic. So what we do whenever we're looking for the reason for a statement, we kind of look at the whole proof as, as a whole. So I usually look at the statements that were given before and I see what would lead to the following statement. So here we're given that angle W and angle U are supplementary and that angle V and angle U are supplementary. Then they tell you that angle W plus angle U is equal to 180, and that's because of the definition of supplementary angles. The same thing can be said for the measure of angle V and angle U. Since they are also supplementary, then that means that they will also add up to 180. So for this reasoning, I would also say that this is the definition of supplementary angles. So that would be that for that one. After that, the rest is given, or the rest is done for you, so we can just go ahead and submit. Okay, now here we are told that angle UXV, so UXV, the one with the red line, is congruent to TXU, also the one with the red arc there. And that those two angles, that TXU and angle UXV, which are those same angles, add up to 180 because they form a linear pair. Now what they've done here is that they have substituted angle UXV with angle TXU twice, since they also would equal to 180 because they would be congruent. Therefore, the measure of angle TXU is equal to 90 degrees. If that equals to 90 degrees, then that means that UW, the line here, is perpendicular to TV. So we could say here that this is the definition of perpendicular lines, because if they're perpendicular lines, then those angles are equal to 90 degrees. And I mean, again, we use like the little symbols here to kind of give us clues. This means perpendicular, so definition of perpendicular lines. Okay, here we are told that XY is perpendicular to WX and that UV is perpendicular to TU. That means that angle WXY is equal to 90 and angle TUV is also equal to 90. Therefore, these angles would equal to each other, and we can see that it's because they are both equal to 90. So let's look at the reasonings they give here. It's not algebra, we didn't do any algebra. It's not reflexive, because reflexive would be like, let's say the measure of angle W is equal to, or is congruent to the measure of angle W. And that would be the reflexive property of equality, where the measure of angle W is equal to the measure of angle W. These are essentially the same thing, except congruence uses the congruent symbol and equality uses the equal sign. Substitution could be that, because if we were to think about that, if we were to take this statement, the measure of angle WXY is equal to 90, and substitute it with TUV, that could work, but let's keep looking. This is the transitive property of congruence. If it's a property of congruence, it has to use the congruent symbol, which it doesn't. Remember that this is the congruent symbol, this is the equal sign. Or the transitive property of equality. Now, I like this one the most for this statement because the transitive property states that if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. So what that means is this is A is equal to B, and this is, let's say, C is equal to B. So they both equal to the same thing, so that means that you can make these two equal. So we would say transitive property of equality. Okay, here it says complete the proof that angle RTS is congruent to PTQ. So here we have PTQ plus QTR is equal to 180. So let's see, PTQ and QTR is equal to 180. You can see that it forms a straight line. So those angles would add up to 180 because the angles make a linear pair, because as you can see, if you add this angle with this angle, they form a line. So that's a linear pair, which is also the statement right underneath it. And it would make sense because QTR plus RTS also form a linear pair. So it would be the same reasoning as the one below. Then so we have those. Then they use the transitive property here, just like in the previous proof, where you have one statement is equal to 180, another statement is also equal to 180. So that means that this statement and this statement would equal to each other. Then what they've done is that to get from line 3 to line 4, it looks like they subtracted the measure of QTR from both sides. And if you subtract them, then you're left with PTQ is equal to RTS, which that's why they use algebra, because you did subtraction. Now, if the measures are equal, that means that the angles are congruent. So this would be definition of congruence, because again, if the measures are equal, then that must mean that the angles or line segments or whatever are congruent. Okay. Here we are told that U and V are complementary and U and W are complementary. If they are complementary, that means that their angles would add up to 180 to 90, which is what we see here. The measure of angle U plus V is equal to 90. So that is the definition of complementary angles. Because that's exactly what complementary angles are, that the angles add up to 180. I keep saying 180, add up to 90. And same thing here, U and W are complementary, so that means if you add them, that you would get 90 degrees. So again, definition of complementary angles. Then they use the transitive property here again, because they have this is equal to 90, they have that this is equal to 90. So that means that U plus V must equal to U plus W. And then here what they've done is they've subtracted the measure of angle U to both sides. Because if you subtract them, then they would both cancel, and you're left with the measure of angle V is equal to the measure of angle W. So since we would subtract, that means that we used algebra. And then see the measures of those angles, that means that they are congruent, so the definition of congruence. Okay, here we are told that P and Q are supplementary and R and P are supplementary. So what they've done is that they've added P and Q, and if they're supplementary, it equals to 180. So that's the definition of supplementary angles. And same thing with angles R and P. If you add them, because they're supplementary, it equals to 180. So definition of supplementary angles. Now here, this is the same logic that we've seen before. So notice that a lot of these proofs have patterns, and there's a lot of things that you can look for to let you know exactly what reason to use. Like here, we've seen this pattern before where we're given two statements that both equal to the same thing. So then since they're equal to the same thing, you make what's before the equal sign equal to each other. So P plus Q must equal to R plus P. So this is the transitive property of equality. Now, what they've done here is that then they subtract the measure of angle P to both sides. And if you subtract them, they would cancel, and you're left with the measure of angle Q is equal to the measure of angle R. So even though they have it written backwards, it's the exact same statement. So what they've done here is algebra, because you subtracted the measure of angle P from both sides. Then because these angles are congruent, or rather equal to each other, they're measures, that means that those angles must be congruent, and that is the definition of congruence. Now here we got to give the entire thing. So it says here that angle PTQ is congruent to angle QTR. So that is a given statement. Usually either the first or second are usually given. So if these are congruent, PTQ and QTR, that's what we're told. And as you can see, if you add these two angles together, they form that line PR. So this right here is because they form a linear pair. So that's angles forming a linear pair sum to 180. Then here we have PTQ plus PTQ, so itself is equal to 180. What they've done is they've substituted QTR with PTQ. See how it's the same exact statement. The only difference is that this was changed to this. And since they are perpendicular, that must mean that they're both equal to 90, and that's why they substituted. So this would be substitution. Then because they are both equal, that must mean that it equals to 90 degrees. So let's see, what can we say? Well, it's not any of these because we didn't substitute, we didn't use a transitive property, it's not reflexive, it's not definition of supplementary angles, it's not definition of perpendicular lines, it's not complementary angles because they add up to 180, it's not an angle bisector. This must be algebra. And the reasoning for that would be if you were to add these two together, that means that you have 2 of PTQ is equal to 180. So if you divide 2 to both sides, you get that the measure of PTQ is equal to 90 degrees. So that's why I chose algebra. And if they equal to 90 degrees, that means that QS and PR is perpendicular. So 90 degrees is the definition of perpendicular. So definition of perpendicular lines. And again, the perpendicular symbol kind of gives you a clue there. All right, I'm pretty sure this is the last one because Delamo said you only need to get to an 85. Now here we are told that UV is perpendicular to TU and RS is perpendicular to QR, which is given here at the beginning. So both of these are given statements. Now, the measure of angle TUV is equal to 90 degrees. If these are perpendicular lines, that means that the measures must be 90, and that is just the definition of perpendicular lines. Let me just make sure and look at the rest of it. Yes, definition of perpendicular lines means that this is 90. And the same thing for QRS, because these are perpendicular, that must mean that those are 90 degrees. So again, definition of perpendicular lines. I want to make sure that that's right. Yeah. So if the measure of angle TUV is equal to the measure of QRS, again here what they've done is the transitive property of equality, because since TUV is equal to 90 and QRS is equal to 90, that means that these two must equal to each other. So transitive property of equality. And because their angle measures are equal, that means that the angles must be congruent. So that is the definition of congruence. And that's Ixl C8. After this, once you get to the left side, you don't have to do any more.